Welcome to the News House. I'm Taylor Epps, and I'm joined by activist and artist Robert Shetterly, whose portrait series, Americans Who Tell the Truth, is a part of a special exhibit and talk here at Syracuse University. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Taylor. I'm delighted to be here.
So I want to start by talking about what inspired your series, Americans Who Tell the Truth, which you started in the early 2000s. Where did the original idea come from, and when did you decide it wasn't just going to be one single painting?
Let me say first that I actually didn't want to do this. I mean, I was another kind of artist. I'm a self-taught artist. I spent a lot of years trying to develop a voice and a technique, and it really, what came out of me was surrealism. You know, being able to paint about ambiguity and mystery, and trying to layer it with all kinds of metaphors and have, you know, humor, but have darkness, have light, have irony, have all kinds of references in the pictures, and challenge my audience to go with me if they could, or find their own stories in it. I love doing that. What happened was right after 9/11, actually within a few days or even a few hours in some cases, people from the Bush administration, and this is in 2001, September of 2001, began talking about a response to 9/11 being to attack the country of Iraq. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction. Iraq didn't have Al-Qaeda. I mean, all these claims were being made. And I've lived in this country long enough and seen enough of this stuff to know when a government is lying. I mean, let me just say that everybody's government lies at various times to protect interests, to be secret, to do whatever they do, but sometimes they might think it's a good reason. Usually it's not a good reason. I mean, why do people lie? But anyway, I was so distraught. I was so angry. I was so full of grief. You know, when you think about starting a war, as they wanted to do, attack this country that had not attacked us, there are going to be millions of victims. You know, our soldiers, their soldiers, and lots of civilians. One can imagine taking on that moral burden if it's absolutely necessary. This was a case where it was absolutely not necessary. There was no reason, good reason. There might have been geopolitical reasons, there might have been energy reasons, there's oil, but there was not a good reason for a war. And I kept thinking, what can I do? I felt terribly isolated, not just in the little town I live in Maine, but I felt isolated from this country. I felt alienated, deeply alienated. And I thought, I've got to find some way to reconcile myself back to this country and, and find a voice at this moment. And I couldn't figure out how to do it at first because I was following my emotions, which were anger and grief. And I thought, I know enough about art, and I've done this for a long enough time to know that nobody wants to have anger and grief shoved in their face. It just doesn't work. And I thought, well, okay, I've got to find another way. And finally it occurred to me that was kind of an art therapy project, was to surround myself with people that make me feel good about the country, rather than, rant anymore about the people who didn't. And that's where this came from. I had in my own studio, I have a wall pinned up with other people's paintings, quotes from places, just odds and ends, things I find interesting. I just stick them up there. And one day I was just looking at that wall, and there was a quote that I'd put there years ago from Walt Whitman, America's arguably greatest poet. And I read the quote that I'd put there, and I thought, I'm going to paint his portrait. I'm going to scratch those words into the portrait, and I'm going to feel better. And that's all I needed at that moment. And that's where it all began. And at the time, it was one picture. I was going to make that picture. That was going to do the job for me. And then I was going to go on with my life as a surrealist. But in the process of painting that picture and noticing how my own psyche changed by being in relationship with Walt Whitman and what he was saying about how we have to be in relationship with every living thing in the world. And feeling this sense of, he may be the greatest Democrat, small d Democrat of this country ever, because he didn't just love all people, he loved all living things and realized that we have to be in relationship to all living things, not just other people, if we want to survive on this planet. I mean, he was prescient about. Anyway, that picture affected me deeply. It affected the people I showed it to deeply, and then it suddenly sort of talked back to me and said, "You've got other work to do here. Paint a few more of these." And I decided, well, I would paint 50 portraits. I had never painted a portrait in my life. I was going to paint 50 portraits. I was going to call them Americans Who Tell the Truth, and then I was going to give the whole thing away. And that actually made me feel the freest I've ever felt in my life.
So you were going to start with those 50, but now you're at 238, that's right? So what do you think make this project so prolific?
What I wanted to do after I started to get into it a little bit was paint portraits of people who have tried to close the gap in this country between what we say is the country, what the ideals of the country are, and the way they actually play out. Like we wrote a declaration and we wrote a constitution that talks about the rule of law and justice for everybody. That didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? And then if we're going to be reconnected to the actual sentiment of those ideals, how is that going to happen? It's not going to happen because rich white guys wake up one day and say, "Oh my God, we forgot to free the slaves. We forgot to give women the right to vote." That isn't what's going to happen. It's going to happen because the marginalized people who believe in that language even more deeply than the people who wrote it. I mean, that's the important thing. They believe it more deeply than the people who wrote it, are going to demand that it be made real for them. And it became clear to me as I started to do this that I'm going to keep doing this until I run out of subjects, in a sense of people who are still fighting that battle to close the gap between the ideals and the reality. And there's just no end of it. I mean, every day a new story comes to me. Somebody will send me something and say, "You've got to paint this person." Most often I've never heard of that person, but a lot of times I'll look up the person and say, "Yeah, that's a subject that I haven't really touched yet." Like I just recently painted Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement. Well, that wasn't a movement 10 years ago. There wasn't a face to go with it. And now there is, and there she is, and I've painted her. And so things keep happening like that, and I think, at some points I think, well, okay, there's enough, but the next day something happens and somebody shows a kind of courage or a kind of determination or, something that affects me strongly. And then I think, oh, I've got to do that. So I'll never live long enough to, I've got now hundreds of names on a list of potential portraits. I'll never do it.
Right. So you talked about finding that voice, and you were able to channel your anger and turn it into what has become your life's work. For young people or college students who might be angry or concerned about the current political climate, how do you recommend they channel their concerns?
Well, I recommend doing something like what I did, is that looking at, trying to find, examine your own anger. Anger is a good thing. It's not like it's a bad thing. Whenever there's injustice, one needs to be angry. The question is what you do with it. And then is to find some way, and think carefully about this, that is able to use your passion about what's wrong, what caused the injustice, to remedy it in some way. If you've got there's a grievance, find a way to remedy the grievance. And whether it's, art is a way, writing is a way, marching in the street is a way. And it's particularly good if you can find a group, because one of I found that one of the best antidotes to being isolated with your own anger or your own grief is finding a group that's working around a problem and finding a community then. There's nothing like a community to lift your spirits even when you're working on something that's difficult and dark. And so I would recommend certainly finding those groups, aligning yourself with them, working with other people. Whatever the issue is, there are people doing something about it. We just don't hear about them very often, which is, I'm glad you're going into, journalism, because that's one of the things that's so missing from a lot of journalism, is who are the people and who are the organizations that are actually trying to fix the problems. Not just the the titillating stuff about, you know, murders and crises of certain sorts, but who's actually working on it? You know, who are the people we can trust? You know, we live in a moment where governments aren't governing properly. They're not taking care of the future for people your age or even younger. They're not doing it. Who's doing that? And there are lots of great organizations and people who are doing that work.
So I know you started with historical figures like Walt Whitman, as you said. You have Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, and I know you said that people send you people that you need to paint, but walk me through the process of how you pick the person and start that painting.
Well, let me give you an example of someone who came to me or how it happened, and then, you know, how I responded to it. So I had a show of, there's a little museum in Washington, D.C. called the Sewell Belmont House, which is a museum for the women's rights movement. And they asked me to put on a show there of early proponents of women's rights. And so I had Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and, you know, Alice Paul, people like that, plus people like Frederick Douglass, who was a great advocate for women's rights. While I was there, they invited me to come and give a talk, and I did, and then a group of women who were there at the talk came up to me afterwards and said they were from Virginia, and would I paint a woman from Virginia? And I said, well, send me some names. And, you know, a couple of months later, I got this long list of names, and on this list was a girl named Barbara Johns. In 1951, Barbara Johns was 16 years old and going to the Moton High School in Farmville, Virginia, which is Southern Virginia. It was, you know, at the time, an all-black school, separate but equal. And she was getting angrier and angrier. She was smart, she was ambitious, and she knew she wasn't getting a good education. And it wasn't the fault of her teachers, but they had 450 kids in a school that was built for 200. They had no library. They had, some of the classrooms were broken down school buses. They had very little heat. I mean, it was not a place to learn. And she thought, I'm going to do something about this. And with a couple of other people, she organized a plan which led to her getting, you know, by subterfuge, getting the principal out of the school, calling the whole school together, giving a speech to the entire school that said, we need a better school. I'm going to walk out of this is Barbara talking now, I'm going to walk out of this school right now and go to the superintendent's office, the white guy, and demand, she wasn't interested in education. This is in integration, this is 1951. She was interested in just separate but really equal. And 450 kids walked out of that school with her, went to the superintendent's office, who threatened her and said, you know, if you don't go back to school right now, you'll all be suspended and your parents will lose their jobs. I mean, that was a typical civil rights kind of ploy, which actually was often followed up on, that people who spoke out lost their jobs. And that's one of the reasons, before often as much as the violence that happened around people speaking up was losing your job. She said, basically, forget it, we're going on strike. You know, we're in charge here, not you. And we're going to strike this school until you replace it with a really equal school. That case went into the courts. It became one of the prime cases of Brown versus Board of Education. It started with a 16-year-old girl. It didn't start with Thurgood Marshall, you know? And there's a whole lot more history around this and behind it of how it all worked out and why they were looking for a case like that and everything else. And part of the process of doing what I do has led me to, you know, not only Barbara John's portrait then, but you know, the people who were had envisioned this whole process well before her. But so then I got in touch with, you know, people in Virginia. I found some little graduation photographs in black and white of her graduating from high school. You know, I made a much bigger picture of it, you know, and in color and everything, trying to imagine what she looked like. And then it was unveiled at Terry McAuliffe's house in Virginia, who was the head of the Democratic Party. I mean, it was an amazing process of awareness for me, and then using it to bring awareness to other people about where some of the changes in this country come from. And I've painted now a lot of young people, because often it's the passion of young people which has led to big changes. One doesn't, we make a fetish in this country about voting, as that's the highest of our democratic ideals. It isn't. Often the people who commit civil disobedience, the people who lead protests, the people who are adamant about causes, who have no access to vote, are the ones who actually drive this country into a position where you actually can vote about something. For instance, women couldn't vote for the right to vote. Well, how did we get there then? It's because people actually committed civil disobedience. They broke the law. They went to jail. This whole process, was gone through, and then we get to that point. And it's what happens before all that that interests me. That's the people I paint, who drive that process to the point where we then, as a whole society, can decide on something.
So this Syracuse exhibit is the first time that all 238 paintings are on display all together. What kind of planning and considerations did you have to make to do all this?
Well, the planning and consideration was more Syracuse's than mine. Now, I've been working here at Syracuse for about 6 years. Professors have been bringing small groups of these paintings here and enabling me to go into classrooms all across the curriculum. And it's particularly driven by a man named Jim Clark, who's a professor in the drama department, who has been working with me all during this time and promoting this show. And so it was his vision about a year ago that brought this all together. I had never dreamed of actually seeing the entire exhibit myself in one place. I thought it would be a nice idea, but I didn't think it would happen. And I wasn't prepared for the cumulative effect of the show and what it would look like.
Well, it's amazing. And I know you're going to have, here in Syracuse, two of your subjects do a talk, Richard Bowen and Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha. Why did you want to talk with them, and how will that interaction add to this message you're trying to deliver?
Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha and Richard Bowen are basically two whistleblowers. I've painted a lot of whistleblowers, and they were chosen by the committee here who's putting together the talk as much as by me. We were looking for people we thought would be particularly interesting for students to hear. Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha is an Iraqi-American pediatrician from Flint, Michigan, who blew the whistle on the lead in the water there. This is a terrible crime that happened years ago now and still isn't fixed in this country. And she's just an incredibly smart, passionate person who will not let this subject go until economic justice and environmental justice is done for the people in Flint. Richard Bowen is sort of the other end of the spectrum. He was a risk assessment officer at Citigroup. Citibank was the biggest bank in the world. And in the lead up to the big recession in 2008, he blew the whistle on all the felonies they were committing in terms of fraud about mortgages and bundling mortgages into securities and then reselling them. He was trying to protect the bank from its own corruption and then protect the this country's economy and the world economy from the failure of the biggest bank in the world. They fired him for bringing the bad news, and then the economy collapsed. They didn't want to listen to him, and we've all paid a huge price for that. But he's, I find that, in whether it's government or corporations or, any institutions, they all have a code of ethics. Most people who go into them think that they will generally follow those, and they think it's a good idea. When actually they see that the codes of ethics are being broken, and they start to complain, what they find out is that people in positions of power often know that they're being broken, but have no intention of changing it. And they get fired for trying to do the right thing. Often those same people then become full-time activists around a much bigger picture. And Dr. Mona is like that, and Richard Bowen is like that. And they are spectacular examples for young people who are about to go out into the world and get jobs, often in these big institutions, thinking that everybody supports ethical behavior there, only to find out that's not quite the case. And how important it is then to insist that the corruption be exposed. Our society, a democratic society, can't persist, can't be healthy if that kind of corruption can go on. if people can be treated that unequally, if some people can make billions of dollars off of corruption at the expense of a whole society. It's untenable, and we have a great debt to owe for people like that.
Now I know, lastly, really quick, you're not supposed to ask a parent who their favorite child is, but do you have a favorite portrait?
Nah, it could be the one I'm working on now, but there are some that I talk about again and again and again. And let me just tell you, do I have time to tell a little story?
I think you should. Let's do a real quick one.
Okay. Every time I answer this question, I pick a different portrait. Let me just tell you that. So it's not exactly, it's my favorite at this moment because I'm thinking about it. Do you know who Woody Guthrie was?
I don't.
Do you know, have you ever sung the song, "This Land Is Your Land"?
Absolutely.
Of course you do. And you probably know the first 2 or 3 verses.
Yep.
Woody Guthrie was a singer-songwriter coming out of Oklahoma and Texas in the 1930s during the Dust Bowl and the Depression. He was the guy who wrote that song. He wrote it because he was very angry about the condition of poor people in this country, and how as the Dust Bowl progressed and the Depression progressed, they were being crushed. You know, we had at that point thousands of refugees in this country, you know, going to places like California looking for work and living in refugee camps. They weren't Syrians, you know, they weren't Iraqis, they weren't, you know, Somalis. They were American farmers from the Midwest living in refugee camps, totally crushed by that moment. He wrote that song kind of in response to that. And the way we sing that song, I mean, first of all, he was just a man who used art, in my estimation, the right way, you know, or in a very powerful way, to authenticate the lives of people who'd been victimized by any situation. I mean, because often we don't even name those people. He not only named them, he wrote songs about them to bring attention to their plight. And he did, you know. And that song, though, "This Land Is Your Land," as we sing it, we use it to celebrate how big and beautiful, and, you know, the Gulf Stream waters, the redwood forest, etc. It's yours, it's mine. Isn't that great? That isn't what the song's about. Our schools do not teach the last verses. The last verse is what all the first part is a setup to him saying, "One bright sunny morning in the shadow of the steeple by the relief office, I saw my people. As they stood hungry, I stood there wondering if this land was made for you and me." That's what the song is about. That's what we don't teach, that big question. Is it these huge income disparities in this country? How can it be yours and mine if we allow this to continue? So at this moment, where we have again gotten to that point of these enormous income disparities that completely counteract the idea of democracy, he's my favorite portrait.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Congratulations on your many successes.
Thank you. Thank you for talking. Great questions.
Of course. So you've been watching an interview with Robert Shetterly, and I'm Taylor Epps for the News House.